Director of DMFI PAC. As we continue to let folks in, and on behalf, I want to thank everybody for joining us on behalf of our chairman, Mark Mellman, and all of our staff for what I hope will be an insightful and illuminating conversation with Amy Walter and Mark Mellman. Today's event is streaming across social media platforms. You can find us at our handle at DemMaj4Israel. If you have questions, you can put them in the comments section. And if you're on Zoom, you can enter them in the Q&A feature located at the bottom of your screen. Please consider checking us out on social media. We're on X, Facebook, Instagram, Threads, and LinkedIn. You can sign up for our news and updates on our website, dmfipac.org. Now, I'm very pleased to introduce a board member from our separate sister organization, Democratic Majority for Israel, Michael Rosenzweig, who will introduce our distinguished guests.
Joel, thank you very much. It's my privilege to introduce Amy Walter. I think Amy is classically one of those people for whom no introduction is necessary, but I'll say a couple of words because we're so thrilled to have her with us. I think everyone on this call is probably very familiar with the insightful analysis that Amy provides consistently of the American political environment. As you all know, she's publisher and editor-in-chief of the Cook Political Report with Amy Walter. She's been named one of Washington's most powerful women, and of course is a regular contributor to PBS NewsHour, NBC's Meet the Press, and CNN's Inside Politics. Amy is also the former political director of ABC News. So we're grateful and really delighted to have Amy here with us to discuss the results of this very consequential election. Amy, over to you.
Thank you, Michael. Glad to be here. And I think what I'll be doing now for just a couple minutes here is giving a 30,000-foot view of what happened the other night. I still don't know what day it is. I keep thinking it's Friday, it's Saturday. I don't know. Apparently it's Thursday, I've been told. But anyway, so what happened, what we're still waiting on, and what we think going forward, the numbers will look like, especially at the House and the Senate. At the presidential level, I think maybe the easiest way to explain what this election was about is that it really was about the fundamentals. And the fundamentals were really, as they often are, much more simple than a lot of folks would like to believe, which is simply this, that when you're an incumbent party, you're an incumbent party with an unpopular president, an incumbent party at a time where 2/3 or more of the population think that things in the country are going off track, and where the aftershocks of both COVID and the very quick and pretty traumatic rise in inflation mean that most voters are still pessimistic about the state of the economy, despite the fact that there have been clear signals of its strength. And so it seems to me that what this election had always been about, and what it ultimately did, what was always about was that tension between the fundamentals, which clearly showed that the incumbent party was coming into the race as an underdog, but also that the challenger was not your typical challenger candidate, was not your typical out-party kind of figure. This person was also an incumbent. And so in that way, we had incumbent versus incumbent. Now, where I think Trump got some benefit, even with all of his baggage, even with his baked-in negatives, even with the things that he continued to say and do that would create a lot of consternation, a lot of hand-wringing, and of course, a lot of denunciation, especially among sort of traditional mainstream media, is the fact that even as people look back on Trump's presidency, even those who didn't like him and still don't like him, they saw his presidency in a much rosier way than they did the current administration of Biden. But it was even rosier than when he was sitting in office. And this was the challenge that the Harris campaign, and well, before them, obviously, the Biden campaign was always up against, which is which were voters going to decide was the bigger risk. The current incumbent, which means staying the course, potentially on policies that people were frustrated with, especially immigration and the economy, or change the course and reelect somebody who they didn't like personally, who they did question many of the ways in which he behaved. They didn't like the ways in which he behaved, but they did like what the economy looked like when he was there. I think it was really telling that in the last set of polls that came out, the national set of polls that came out from all of the big major networks, Trump's retrospective job approval was in the positive territory. As president, Donald Trump was never seen in a positive territory in his job approval rating. So I think even as all of his problems weighed down on his ability to really contrast himself with Harris, the fact that voters did give, I think it's that they viewed him less through the lens of his personality and more through the lens of his presidency. And that was something obviously that Harris worked very hard to shatter, was to try to make the case that, number one, she had economic ideas that were going to help the middle class. She was on the trail talking about this. Their advertising was overwhelmingly focused on the economy. But that in the race on issues, this was one that was never going to be one where she could succeed in beating him. Her only hope was to draw the race closer on those issues, especially on the economy. And to be fair, they did draw it closer. I mean, if you look at where things stood in July, before Biden dropped out of this race, Trump was leading on the question of who do you think would do a better job on the economy by double digits. In the exit polls, it looks like he will win on that question by 8 points. Again, that's still losing, but the odds were that had Biden been the nominee, it would have been a larger number if those numbers held up from July. The thing that I looked at pretty consistently that was telling us a lot about what the election was ultimately going to come down to are two questions. One, we did some of our own polling. We worked with a Democratic firm, BSG, the Benenson Group, and then with a Republican firm, Greg Strimple and his group, GS Strategy Group. And we polled in the 7 swing states. And when we looked at in our last survey, so we didn't go into the field in October, but in late September, we looked at who the undecideds were. And they kind of told you the story of this election, because these were folks who were really truly torn between those two realities. They were very disappointed in the state of the economy. In fact, we're so much more pessimistic about the economy than the overall electorate. 70% of them in September thought inflation was getting worse. Right. So this isn't just, oh, I'm feeling the sort of hangover effect from high prices. These are people who are saying, I think prices are still climbing. So their pocketbook issues were really a big factor for them. At the same time, they said they didn't like Donald Trump. And so these voters also tended to be younger. They were more a diverse group of voters. And then when I looked at this other group, there was another group of voters that we spent a lot of time with. If you look at these group of people who say, and we asked the question this way, do you think, how do you feel about Donald Trump? You like him, you like his policies. Pretty consistently, 35% of that swing state electorate fell into that category. Do you dislike him and also dislike his policies? That's 47% of the electorate. So right there, you see that, where Harris or theoretically any Democrat starts in the swing states is about 47%. Those are the people who just aren't going to vote for Trump really under any circumstance. Trump starts with 35%, people who will vote for him no matter what. But then if you go into that middle group of people, who are they? These are people who say, I don't really like him personally, but I do like some of his policies. And if you add up people who are not anti-Trump all the way, right? They are people that either always love him or like his policies, but don't like him. That's 53% of the swing state electorate. And so the question was always, what's going to happen to those people in the middle, that 19 to 20% of voters who really feel that push and pull? And it seems to me that at the end of the day, those voters decided that they were getting pulled more by their economic concerns than they were getting pulled by their concerns about Trump's behavior. And in fact, I think the fact that Harris will end up, and it's not, we don't have the final data yet, but in most of these states, she's going to end up 47, 48, 49%, tells you that, she got all of those anti-Trump voters, but wasn't able to convert enough of those the skeptical on Trump voters. The other thing I think that is important to appreciate, and this comes down to a question on do campaigns matter? Do candidates matter? And the good news for those of us who love politics and love campaigns and love candidates and think they matter and campaigns matter, I think this election proved that even in a pretty big way. The first is, if we look just at the national vote, right now, Trump is leading in the national popular vote 51% to 48%. Now we're waiting on millions of votes to be counted, and many of them are from blue states. So I expect this number is going to be closer at the end of the day. So maybe 50-48. Let's say that's where it ends up. So Trump winning the popular vote by 2 points, which is a 6-point swing from 2020, which is why in the states that nobody was paying attention to, say New York or Virginia or New Jersey, you saw a shift of basically 5 or 6 points to the right. In the states that were contested, in the states that were the battleground states, Harris is going to end up losing by small margin. And the shift there from where it was in 2020 is not as dramatic. It's anywhere from a point to maybe 4 points. The difference, the shift from Biden to Trump. And again, that's still not enough to win those states for Kamala Harris, but it does tell you that putting money and effort and campaigning in those states did make a difference. The other thing that I find really, really fascinating is the fact that, and again, this is just, I'm not just saying this for Mark Mellman's sake, but I do think the polling industry got a lot right this time. One thing the polls continued to show over the course of the campaign was how much better Democrats were doing in many of these swing states than the top of the ticket, than Harris or Biden, and how much worse Republicans were doing than Trump. Now, we always knew these numbers were going to close. There was no chance that, you were going to see in a state like Nevada or Arizona, where the Democrat was running ahead, the kind of margins that the polls were showing, right? That they weren't going to win these by it wasn't going to be a huge difference, but it was going to be a big enough difference to matter, a big enough difference to make up for Harris losing those states. But we also saw it in those blue wall states like Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Michigan, all of those Democratic candidates doing just a bit better. And at the end of the day, that's exactly what happened. Now, Nevada has still not been called, though it does seem as if Rosen will be able to narrowly hang on to her seat there. Again, that will be an overperformance from where Harris ended up. Pennsylvania, McCormick looking like he is going to be able to unseat Casey. We still waiting on the final numbers there. But even so, Casey will have outperformed Harris. And then, of course, the places where Democrats did not just do better than Harris, but held on to those seats were Wisconsin and Michigan. What I find, as I said, fascinating is we can look at it two ways. You can say, one, what were those Democrats doing right that Harris was doing wrong that allowed them to win? Or you can look at the other side of the equation, because this is the bigger delta, the delta between, Slotkin in Michigan and Harris, or Casey and Harris, is really, really tiny. But between how a Mike Rogers, how a Casey, how a Hovde did in those states, and Trump is bigger. And so what's going on there is just, to me, as interesting as anything else. Because if it's saying, I don't know what, that look, none of those candidates ran as anti-Trump candidates. So, your first instinct would be to say, oh, well, the reason that those Republicans couldn't hit Trump numbers is that they were anti-Trump, or they just weren't willing to embrace Trump. They all did. They all got Trump's endorsement. The other thing you could say is, well, they weren't able to spend the same amount of money. They didn't have the same name ID. And that's true too. But Trump's coattails were just not apparent. In other words, if he had really, really big and deep coattails, if what was happening was not just that this was an election where the Democratic candidate lost, but where we're seeing a dramatic repudiation of Democrats writ large, then I think what you would see is bigger coattails for you would see bigger coattails for the down ballot candidates than we actually saw. When it comes to the House, you can see that as well. We're probably going to end up having more districts carried by both a Democrat and Trump than we will districts carried by Harris and a Republican. Now, we still have, I can't remember what the total number is, maybe 18 or so districts that are still not called. And the way our House editor is looking at things, it seems as if the most likely outcome is that Republicans have a majority somewhere in the 225, 226 seat range, which means that they will have picked up 3 to 4 seats from their 2020. And again, that is pretty remarkable that if what we're saying is we've seen a 6-point swing in the national vote, and it produced pickups of only 4 seats. I think that tells us a couple of things. One, that our House map is already pretty well sorted, and that big swings didn't have as much of an impact because, let's face it, there aren't that many vulnerable seats out there in the ways that there used to be. So where a 4 or 5 point swing isn't enough to shift races, because most of the blue seats are insulated enough and most of the red seats are insulated as well. But in the races that were really, really close, the fact that Democrats were able to hold on or to win, both at the Senate and the House level, I think suggests that, one, it is that candidates and campaigns matter a lot, how they presented themselves, how well they did if they were incumbents, and in staying in touch with their communities. But I do think it also means that we should be careful about making these broad, sweeping generalizations about, what this election says writ large, either about the kinds of voters that come out for Democrats or Republicans, about ways in which the parties did better or worse on certain policies, and even what it says going forward for 2026. This was definitely an election in which as I said, the driving force being frustration with an incumbent party and a continuation of our polarization The fact that Republican success came really only because of success in 3 red states and 1 purple state, which is Pennsylvania, rather than a sweeping win by taking all of the swing state Senate races as well as all of the swing House races. So why don't I leave it at that, and we can talk more through Q&A.
Amy, thank you very much for that. We'll hear more from Amy in a moment, but right now it's my privilege to introduce Mark Mellman. Mark is one of the nation's top pollsters and strategists. I think many of you know that he is co-founder and president of Democratic Majority for Israel, and is also the CEO of the Mellman Group, a polling and consulting firm whose clients include leading political figures, Fortune 500 companies, some of the nation's top and most important public interest groups. Mark has consulted in the campaigns of 30 U.S. senators, a dozen governors, over 3 dozen U.S. representatives, and many, many more state and local officials. So he is very well known in his field. He's past president of the American Association of Political Consultants, and so he's very well respected by his peers in the consulting industry. And he's also a member of that organization's Hall of Fame. But Mark, we're very lucky to have you with us, and I'm happy to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Michael. It's a pleasure to be with you. We have literally hundreds of people on this program. I'd be willing to bet that I am the only fan of the late, great performer named Meatloaf, which is relevant because Meatloaf has a song entitled, "You Took the Words Right Out of My Mouth." Well, that's relevant because the first words on my piece of paper here are, when it comes to presidential elections, I'm a fundamentalist. That's not a statement of my religious convictions. It's a statement about what I think is important in presidential campaigns. Amy and I really started out with exactly the same view. I want to take it in a slightly different direction and put a little exit poll flesh on those bones. The reality is that when I say fundamentals are important, I think when Amy says fundamentals are important, the real issue is what's driving voters here. Is it some underlying factors that are important, or is it the day-to-day activities of the campaign? Some academics a few years ago looked and found, I believe, over 70 moments in a presidential campaign that were labeled game changers by the press and others, and found that not one of them actually impacted the polling, the horse race at all. So we tend to overuse that phrase, but we think about the campaigns, the candidates, and so on. They are important for the reasons Amy suggested when we get something that's different from the baseline. But what's the baseline? Well, the baseline is the fundamentals, and this race is coming pretty close to the fundamentals. What do I mean by that? Well, for example, there are academics who for many years have used models to try and forecast presidential elections based not on candidate qualities, not on answers to poll questions, but simply on underlying fundamentals. For example, the economy. Ray Fair from Yale, one of the first people to do this, has a model that basically has some economic variables in it, and also just a question about, or an indication of whether an incumbent is running or not, which party is the incumbent party. And Ray Fair months ago predicted that this, based on these data, predicted that this would be an election somewhere between 47 and 49% of the vote for Kamala Harris, depending on how the economy broke, and 49% toward the end. That's exactly the number that Amy said is likely to be 48, 49, likely to be the outcome in terms of the popular vote. There's other people that use presidential approval and the economy, and they came out with a forecast that is 48%, which I think is exactly the number that Amy suggested, but very close to the number we're at now, about 47.5% for Harris. These basic fundamentals: how do people regard the incumbent president? How's the economy doing? Predicted this election, presidential election, almost exactly, almost precisely. You didn't need to know anything about the candidates. You didn't have to know anything about who they were, about what they said, about what their positions were, about what the issues were, about what the news was. You You didn't need to know of any of that. You could just predict this election based on knowing a little bit about the economy and a little bit about the president's approval rating. We see echoes of that in the exit poll data too, and I think they're worth taking a look at. So I think they've been sort of under-discussed in some ways. When you look at the exit polls, people who had a positive evaluation of the national economy voted for Kamala Harris by 91 to 8%. 91% of the people had a positive evaluation of the economy. Sorry, 91% of the people who vote, yes, 91% of the people who had a positive evaluation of the economy voted for Kamala Harris. Only 8% voted for Donald Trump. The problem for Democrats, the problem for us, only 31% of voters had a positive evaluation of the economy. So 91% of 31%, not a huge start. On the flip side, 68% of voters had a negative assessment of the economy as it currently stands. 28% of those voted for Kamala Harris anyway, but 70% voted for Donald Trump. 70% voted for Donald Trump. So you see a very significant impact of people's perceptions of the national economy, just as those models suggest. You also see strong correlation between people's perceptions of their own family finances and their voting behavior. People who thought their family finances were getting better voted for Kamala Harris by 82 to 14. 82 to 14. By people who thought it was the same, that there was no change in their family finances, they too voted for Kamala Harris by overwhelming numbers, 69 to 28. The problem, 24% thought their family finances were better, 30% thought their family finances were worse, 46%, just short of half, thought their family finances were worse, and 17% of them voted for Harris, 81% voted for Trump. So again, you see the echoes of these models in the exit poll data. You also see that in terms of presidential approval. Of the people who approved of Joe Biden's performance in office, 96% voted for Kamala Harris, 3% voted for Donald Trump, 96 to 3. Again, the problem, only 40% thought that Joe Biden had done a good job as president. 59% disapproved of his performance in office. And again, 16% of those who disapproved voted for Kamala Harris. 82% voted for Donald Trump. So the economy, presidential approval, that's part of the fundamentals. So is partisanship. How the country is distributed in terms of their partisan allegiances, their partisan loyalties, their partisan identities, because those partisan identities do more to structure their attitudes towards politics than anything else by far. 95% of Democrats voted for Harris, 4% for Trump. Republicans, the mirror image, 5% for Trump, 94% for Harris. Independents voted for Harris by a 3-point margin, 49 to 46. But again, the problem is there are 4 points more Republicans than there were Democrats. When Bill Clinton won the presidency in 1992, there were 6 points more Democrats than Republicans. So again, these things are related. The approval of the president, the situation with the economy, party identification, these are not totally separate silos. They are interrelated, but they show you just how important those factors are in determining the outcome. So again, these fundamentals really did shape the outcome of the race in very important ways. They would have shaped it that way for any Democrat. Could somebody have done better? We'll never know the answer to that. We can't rerun this election under those circumstances and see what the answer is. So we'll just have to live with uncertainty about that. But what we can say, I think, is that this election follows the pattern of other elections historically, that the fundamentals were really critical. This, in many ways, was a contest between whether the fundamentals were really most important or the failures and foibles of Donald Trump were going to be most important to voters. And we have that question resolved. It is the fundamentals that turn out to be more important to voters than the failings of Donald Trump, manifold though they are. There was, for a while, when Joe Biden was in this race, we have to say a sort of third facet to that trade-off between Trump's foibles and fundamentals, and that was whether or not people trusted that Joe Biden had the physical and mental acuity to do the job. And a majority of the country had doubts about that, serious doubts about that possibility. So that's something that was removed from the table when Joe Biden took himself out of the race and Kamala Harris became the nominee. That question was no longer present. So it was really just two sides of this coin. Was it the fundamentals? Was it Donald Trump's failings? And again, the answer, it turns out from voters, is that those fundamentals emerge once again as the most important determinant. Not to say the only factor that mattered here, but the most important. So let me stop there so we have plenty of time for questions. And Joel will lead us in some questions.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Amy. Thank you, Michael. As we said at the top of this call, if you have questions, you can type them into the Q&A feature if you're on Zoom, or you can add it in the comments on one of our social media platforms. Amy, I'll direct the first question towards you. We have a number of questions in the chat talking about the trend line that was in this campaign of decreased Democratic turnout in key states. Whether that's talking about how, Trump nearly hit his 2020 numbers while Democratic turnout is lower. As we said, a number of key blue states still have outstanding turnout. But, given what we know now, what do you think of some of the factors that led to this decreased voter enthusiasm or just general turnout among the Democratic Party folks?
Well, it's an excellent question. And this is the time of the year that I both love the most. I'm with Mark. I love when the election is over because then we actually get to answer the questions that we get asked day in and day out, not just who's going to win, but why they won. So we had two theories of the case. One theory was right, one theory was wrong. Boom, we can explain it, and that's awesome. The one thing we don't have, though, is an explanation of who voted, and we're not going to know that until we get the voter files updated, and then we can really dig into that. We also don't have a final tally of the votes. So I just want people to be wary of when you're looking at some of the numbers, especially even in states where it says, 96% in. Remember, 4% in a big state is still a lot of numbers. So these numbers may change and they will change as we, get further into this month. With all those caveats out of the way, I think the most obvious answer is that the reason that Biden succeeded in many of these states, even by narrow margins in 2020, is that his coalition was made up of the following groups. He won young voters by over 20 points. He won Latino voters by 23, 24 points. He won Black voters by 80 plus points. Harris underperformed with all of those voters. Trump overperformed with those voters. So whichever way you'd like to see that number about, whether you see it as under or overperformance. But if you believe the exit polls right now, the fact that Harris did worse, Biden did better among young voters it's a significant difference. It's going from I think it was 23 to now 9-point difference with young voters. So when we talk about, well, how come his number's bigger and her number's lower than Biden's? Well, when you have that kind of shift, that's why. Same with Latino voters. The other thing that we noticed, and I brought this up about the suburban vote, one thing that I think Democrats were counting on, especially in these battleground blue wall states, was that Harris could make up losing younger voters, losing voters of color, by just cranking up vote share in the suburban vote among white women, among white, maybe college-educated men in those areas. What we're seeing right now is actually an underperformance in those areas. She didn't do as well in Oakland County. I think it's by about 4-point underperformance.
Oakland County, Michigan.
Oakland County, Michigan, sorry. In the county, one of the key suburban counties, Chester County, around Philadelphia, also running behind. So that gets to this question, which is, did they overestimate the kind of vote that they could get from those voters by looking at, say, many of these places I just mentioned, they also had a big number of Nikki Haley voters, right? And this is why you saw, for example, the Harris campaign take Liz Cheney to those very counties that I just mentioned. But that those voters who may have voted for Nikki Haley were either, one, already Democrats. So even if they may be registered as Republicans, they're essentially Democrats and they had been voting as such. So there wasn't really this pool of voters out there, even though it looked like that, voters open to Harris. The other is that just at the end of the day, I think not having Donald Trump in front of you as he was when he was president did matter a lot. And if you are talking about the threat as she was, the threat that he poses to democracy, what happened on January 6th, the threat of abortion access, all of those things were playing out in previous elections in real time. And now the issue of January 6th, the issue of Trump's fitness for office, all of those things have been pretty baked in. And that's why I kept coming back to that 47% number of people who said that they don't like Trump, they don't like his policies. Those people are really locked in. Winning over the other group of voters, you got to get them with something else. And that's really hard to do when you're the incumbent party at a time where people aren't feeling great about the status quo. And so, I think they got as many voters as they could from that anti-Trump coalition. And then some of those anti-Trump coalition voters from 2020 clearly were prioritizing something else. And whether that was the economy or that was immigration, we can't say right now, but I do think the economy was probably the biggest driver.
Great. Mark, do you have anything to add there?
Nope.
Fantastic. So Mark, this next question is for you. A number of our listeners, as viewers rather, want to know, how did pro-Israel Democrats fare and how did DMFI PAC fare on this election cycle?
Well, great question. DMFI PAC, in our primaries, we endorsed 106 candidates, 104 of them won, which means only 2 lost. So we were extremely proud of that record. The general election, as Amy said, still being decided in some places, but so far, 72% of our endorsees have won their elections, 11% have lost, and 18% have yet to be decided. So DMFI PAC, I think in terms of its work, did very, very well. And some of these are very close races. For example, we did independent expenditure for Jackie Rosen, who's been a huge champion of the pro-Israel agenda. And obviously, that's a race could hardly be closer. It's a couple thousand votes. So everything that was done clearly mattered in that race. Very important race. We're seeing that in some of the other House races as well. Jared Golden, who's been a champion, pro-Israel champion in the House, also just won by, again, less than 1% of the vote. And again, we did independent expenditure for him as well. Everything really mattered in that race. I could go on with individual races, but the fact is we invested wisely, and most of our candidates are winning, which is on the positive side. Unfortunately, we are losing some important pro-Israel voices. If Bob Casey loses, which seems to be the consensus at the moment, that will be a loss for the pro-Israel community, Democratic pro-Israel community for sure. And there are some others as well. But the reality is that in terms of DMFI PAC, of the money that we spent, 65% of those dollars went to candidates of color. 46% of that money went to female candidates. So we're very proud of those statistics as well, and of the fact that we're winning the vast majority of those races. We only invest in mostly invest in competitive races. So it's the fact that we're winning so many of them is a great sign. But there is still a battle in the Democratic Party. We shouldn't understate it. We were very fortunate to be involved during the primary season in helping Wesley Bell defeat Cori Bush and George Latimer in defeating Jamal Bowman. But this is a battle that we are winning, but it's not a battle that has been won. And that's something we need to continue to, we'll continue to fight, and for which we need everybody's engagement and support. Just to give you one example, next week we expect that Senator Bernie Sanders is going to introduce a resolution of disapproval to block arms sales from the United States to Israel, as Israel is in the midst of a war on 5 fronts. We think this is a dangerous and counterproductive move, and really important that we, all of us who are engaged here, be in touch with our senators to make sure they vote against it. I don't know if it's going to get a vote in the House. It doesn't have to, it may. But again, we'll have to be mobilized for that effort as well. So lots of battles still to fight, but a relatively good night, all things considered, for pro-Israel Democrats.
Thanks, Mark. Mark, do you have anything to add on terms of just general Jewish turnout in the election? People say there's mixed kind of numbers coming out of different exit polls, but how do you have a sense of just the general breakdown or shifts, since folks feel like some of the information they're seeing is contradictory?
Yes, we certainly don't know about turnout, so I'm not even going to start with that for the reasons that Amy suggested. But we have 2 different polls, one of which is truly an exit poll, one of which is not. But we call them both exit polls, that tells 2 somewhat different stories. The AP NORC VoteCast poll, which is not really an exit poll, they poll people during the week before the election and in various modes and methods. It's not people standing outside the the polling places. But in that poll, 66% voted for Harris to 32%. 66% for Harris to 32% for Trump. Which would represent a decline a small decline from the past. In terms of Democratic support, there is the network exit poll, which today is not just an exit poll because a lot of people vote by mail and so on. So they do polling in advance among the people who we know voted by mail or in person early. They have a somewhat different story. 79% voting for Harris, 21% for Trump, compared to 71% in 2016. So one of these polls says there's been a slight improvement over the last several years. One says there's been a slight erosion in Democratic support over the last few years. But I think what we can say for sure is that there's overwhelming support from the American Jewish community for Kamala Harris, whether it's 66% or 79%. That's among the strongest numbers for any segment of the American population. It's still overwhelming support. What we really don't know is whether that's an increased level of support or a decreased level of support, but the increases or the decreases, whichever way it went, are fairly modest. I should add one other piece of data to the discussion, which is the Cooperative Congressional Election Study, which is based in Harvard and Tufts, and has a very large sample that they interview, about 80,000 people. So even though we're only 2% of the population, they have a significant number of Jews that they're interviewing. And they did it in the month before the election, so during October, and they had it 66% for Harris, 32% for Trump. I should also add that the network exit poll, which had the 79% for Harris, doesn't poll states for various reasons, doesn't poll a number of states that have large Jewish populations like New York, California. So it's a messy sort of situation. We don't really know the answer, but I think what we can say with certainty, overwhelming support for Harris.
Thank you, Mark. Amy, I'll go to you with this next question. Given all the givens of what we know and don't know, the infighting has already begun with those in the Democratic Party, with folks like Senator Sanders saying the party needs to go more to the left. There are folks on the other end saying the party, like Congressman Tom Suozzi, who said it was the embrace of transgender rights, and the ads that were run by the Trump campaign in recent weeks that doomed the Harris campaign. What, if anything, can we actually say at this point in time about whether or not the party needs to tack left or right in coming elections, or is that all just speculation at this point?
Well, it is all speculation, which makes it fun, Joel. That's what we do. Especially when we don't have elections, we just speculate. We just talk. Nobody knows. Because you got to live, I don't know if any of you growing up played those games where you get to choose your own adventure. Those books where you're like, do you cross the river with your cattle, or do you stay on this side of the river and, whatever, take your chances. And that's basically what we're trying to figure out. Look, I think I'm going to go back to Mark's point about the fundamentals, which is the biggest problem that Democrats had was the economy. Now, the second biggest problem was a policy problem, which I would argue was the immigration issue, because what it allowed Republicans to do was to cast the Democratic Party as the party that will make you less safe. Now, whether you believe in having more immigration or less immigration, whether you think that Trump exaggerated a lot of these stories about crime coming from migrant communities, what you can't deny is the fact that there were a record number of people coming into this country, whether, by illegally or surrendering themselves to authorities at the border, that just overwhelmed not just the border communities, but the places in which they ended up going to or being bused to, these major American cities. And so that was a real policy choice made by Democrats at the very beginning of the administration. And it wasn't changed until, well, just a few months before the election. And so I do think, would Democrats be in a different boat if the border situation had been different? Again, it's a choose your own adventure. I can't say, if you said, I'm keeping inflation the same, but I'm changing the situation on the border, would that have helped? It might have helped, just in that it took one quiver out of Republicans' arrow, and it took away a pretty potent argument that I think Republicans made and Trump made on the trail, that the Harris administration would not only continue these sorts of policies, but given where she moved to in 2019 on issues like immigration, that which she since renounced, but during 2019, when she was running much further to the left, and those of you in swing states saw those ads about, supporting transgender care for illegal immigrants who were in the federal prison system. But, that, I think that was important, and was an important way to define Harris as somebody who was out of the mainstream, and the Democratic Party is out of the mainstream. And the movement among Latino voters didn't just happen overnight. It is something that has been moving pretty consistently for these last few elections, whether it was, in 2020, then we saw it in 2022, we see it in 2024. So if you're Democrats and you're looking at that and you say, oh, well, it's about the economy, and as soon as the economy gets back, we're going to win them back, I think that is an inaccurate reading of it. At the same time, I do think that you have to appreciate these elections for what they are. And this was not an open seat election. I think 2028 is going to be a totally different story. If Democrats do go into 2028 with the thinking that, boy, in order to win a national election, or maybe more accurately, this is a better way to say it, if they go into the 2028 election thinking, here's what I need to do to win a Democratic primary, rather than here's what I need to do to win a national election, you may end up in the same place that we saw from Harris in this election, which is, you can win a primary. She obviously didn't, but anyway, she was moving to the left in many ways as a reflection of where the vote was going on the left, and as such, put herself in a really dangerous position in the general election. Biden didn't move as much as all the other candidates who were running that year. And I think that is what helped him win in 2020 in the first place.
Great. Thank you. Mark, we're getting a number of questions in the chat, about kind of what role you feel like race and gender played in this election. I think, that's one of the, as Amy said, when we have nothing else to talk about, we talk about theories and ideas, and that's one of the theories and ideas that seems to be rather prevalent, is that, Democrats should never run another woman again for 20 years, or that, America's not ready to have a female Black or half or Asian American Pacific Islander president, et cetera. Kind of what do you see about what are your thoughts on that, I guess?
Well, let me try and separate this into two pieces. I did an extensive analysis of the data from the 2016 election, and it was quite clear that a number of the motivations for people voting for Trump over Hillary Clinton were misogyny and racism and xenophobia. There's just no question about that. There's no question that some of the people who moved between the 1990s and the early 2000s and the Trump years moved because of misogyny, racism, xenophobia. I think there's no question about that. Does that mean, and I think that's still true of the Republican Party today. The Republican Party today, I think, is definitively more misogynist, more racist, more xenophobic than Democrats. And when I say the party, I don't mean just the party leadership. I mean the rank and file members of the party. There is that difference. Having said that, I don't think that's the same thing as saying a woman can't win, an African American can't win, an Asian American can't win. I don't think that's true. I think in the right circumstances with the right candidate, we know an African American can win because one did. We know we don't know in the same way that a woman can win, but I believe a woman can win for certain. But it has to be in the right circumstances, and it has to be the right candidate.
Great. Amy, my next question's for you. We talked some about split ticket voters a little bit earlier during your introductory remarks, but a phenomenon that some folks have had some questions about is, we saw abortion ballot measures outperform Kamala Harris in a lot of places, even in places where outperforming, statewide candidates at other levels in the Senate and other places. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I love those questions because what they do is they illuminate this mystery known as the American voter, and that is American voters are human, and humans have lots of different opinions that sometimes are in conflict with the people that they vote for. How they choose to vote in a binary choice between a D and an R is very different from getting to choose how they vote on a policy issue. So every time a voter has to go to the polls and say, all right, do I vote for this candidate or that candidate? They've got to put this cognitive dissonance machine to work, right? Which is the most important thing for me, that, this party represents my opinions and views on 60%, and these guys 30%, and nobody gets me on this issue. Do I always go with the 60%, or sometimes do I go to 30%, or do I just sit at home? And so when you put issues, whether it's, look in conservative states, when you put Medicaid expansion on the ballot, when you put a $15 minimum wage on the ballot, those things succeed, right? Even in conservative places. When you put abortion access, even in conservative places, on the ballot, they succeed, even as those folks are voting up and down the ballot for Republicans. The real thing, I think, what the abortion initiatives taught us, if anything, is that there are plenty of pro-choice Trump voters. And to me, this was one of the things that Trump was really effective at doing, which was downplaying and being able to sort of distance himself from the decision, the Dobbs decision, which his presidency made a reality. And I don't know if you remember what those numbers were, Mark, but what is just, again, you have to remember that most Americans are not following politics like we are. They're normal people. They're not weird political people, okay, who obsess about these things. And the number of people who thought that Biden was responsible for Roe v. Wade being overturned because he was the president when it happened, right? So there's a difference between a voter knowing that this person is responsible for this bill or this action because they were the governor when a 6-week abortion ban passed, or they were sitting in office and they voted for the following piece of legislation, is a lot easier to follow than the court. Trump also is famous about being able to, sort of manipulate his way around getting caught supporting things that are now unpopular. And finally, he never ran as a culture warrior on that sort of thing, on abortion, as much as he did on immigration. And I think that gave him a little bit of a leeway. Finally, I do wonder, look, if you think about life before Harris was the candidate, when Biden was on top of the ticket, and this was especially true after that debate in June, the great worry among Democrats was that turnout was going to crater, and that this wasn't just going to be a blowout at the presidential level, but it was going to be a blowout all across the ballot. And that what a ballot initiative in a swing state like Nevada or Arizona could do is actually turn out voters who they were never going to vote for Trump, but they weren't excited to vote. Here was a reason to get them to vote. With Harris on the ticket, I think it had the effect in many ways of giving some of those voters who liked Trump, but also were wary about the abortion issue, an opportunity to have your cake and eat it too.
Thank you. We're going to do one final question before we turn it over to our Democratic Majority Board co-chair, Ann Lewis. This last question, prognosticating, putting on those hats, what is your way too early prediction for the 2026 election cycle? Mark, we'll start with you.
Well, I think it's going to be a very good election cycle for Democrats. Why do I say that? Because midterms tend to be better for the party out of power, and we are definitively the party out of power for these next 2 years. Second, we have the example of Trump's first go-round, and he so alienated people as president that we had a great year in 2018. I'm doing my years correctly. I think he's even more likely to alienate people this time because he has none of the people around him who tended to moderate him during his last presidency, and he has none of the interest in making sure that he's available for yet another term. So this is an opportunity for Trump to go wild, and Trump gone wild is hard to imagine given how Trump normally is, but it's likely to be even worse.
Great. Amy?
I would tend to agree with that, that, it's usually good for the party out of power. We've had now 9 elections out of 10 that have seen a flip in power of the House, the Senate, or the White House. So I would bet on change. The Senate, of course, is always about, so that's, the House is a little bit easier, and especially because, as I said, we're going to see Republicans with like an 8-seat majority, not a 25-seat majority. The Senate's a different story because, as we all know, it's whatever the map is what the map is. It's not all 100 senators up. It's just that third that are up that year. Now, Democrats are playing some defense in places like Georgia. This is John Ossoff's cycle. So that will be an important seat to defend. And then in terms of the open or competitive seats on the Republican side, Maine would probably be the easiest with Susan Collins. I would be surprised if she ran again. She might, but I would not bet on that. But then you got to knock off, places like North Carolina and Ohio. Not impossible, North Carolina being closer, but to make up the 4 or so seats lost, you're going to have to go into some red country in order to make up for that.
Great. Well, thank you, Mark. Thank you, Amy. And thank you to all of our attendees for joining us. I'm going to turn it over now to Democratic Majority for Israel Board Co-Chair Ann Lewis to close us out.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Joel. Thank you, Mark and Amy. And thanks to all of you who are listening in. We came into this election knowing the stakes were high for the strength of democracy and democratic policies here at home, and support for the U.S.-Israel relationship even more crucial since the barbaric attacks of October 7th. Well, going over the latest results today, listening to our terrific speakers, I have to say the stakes before us are even higher. After 2 years of the results of the Dobbs decision, we've seen 2 years of vulnerable women turned away from life-saving care. I have to say how proud I am of the candidates DMFI supported who are out there standing up for basic rights like women's health. I'm proud of our support for elected leaders who stand up and speak out against anti-Semitism. And you've heard twice about Jackie Rosen today from Amy and from Mark, but I'll add my own shout out because she's been such a leader. And I'm proud of the record of our support for Israel. Right now, as we speak, we have been working to stop Bernie Sanders' attempt once again to deny Israel the means to defend itself, even at such a crucial moment. And you can help, every one of you who's listening in, on speaking out and writing and calling your senators, telling your friends to mobilize and help. We need to continue at DMFI to keep the spotlight on anti-Israel members of Congress, as we did in this last cycle with 2 soon-to-be ex-members who were of the squad, and why their constituents deserve better. And we need to prepare for a new round of debate within the Democratic Party, because as you've heard, there are people claiming that Kamala lost because of her support for Israel. Well, the results of Tuesday's election were painful in many ways, but they were reassuring on this one. They support for Israel and the U.S.-Israel relationship is both good policy and good politics. And be clear, Democrats do not win by turning our backs on Israel. That would actually make the party weaker, not stronger. We have the facts to disprove this anti-Israel strategy, and we will be taking those facts and getting them out, but we need your help too to get the message out. So for all of you on this call who have been supporting DMFI, thank you. Thank you for making sure there is a strong pro-Israel, pro-democracy voice within the Democratic Party. Please continue to stay in touch with us by phone, by email, by social media, like X and Threads and LinkedIn and Instagram. Whatever your message of choice, we look forward to continuing to work with you. Thank you.
Amy, thank you very much again.
Thanks, guys. We'll talk to you soon.
Yes.
Take care. Thanks, Joel. Thanks, Ann.
Look
Michael.
after those dogs.
I know it. They're still staring at me.
Well, you have raised a subject I'm now thinking about, which is the effect of daylight savings. Next time there is a congressional debate on daylight.
I'm telling you, just everybody bring their dogs and their babies and say, this is what you've done. All of them are off. It takes forever to get them back on the clock. Or maybe make the members who vote against it come and babysit for you with a cranky toddler who thinks it's time to get up. Yeah.
That is a C-SPAN episode that would